They call it the Martin House, and it's easily the most haunted place in town. During the day, it's a beautiful 2-story estate in the Millville area. It sits behind a high gate overlooking the bay on 10 acres, which comes at a premium given the land's cost inside of Panama City. The current owner keeps up the grounds, maintains the home, but they say he will not live in the house or be there after night. He rents it out for parties and events, lets people picnic on the grounds, opens it during the day for tours and historic outings. But an hour before sunset, the gates are locked and the place is cleared of people. It's a beautiful place, but they say that the devil walks there after dark. The local legend says that Mr. Martin suspected his wife was having an illicit affair with a servant. They say that in a fit of jealousy, he made her watch as he hung him, later hanging his wife and kids and himself from the same large tree in the front yard. They say you can hear voices, screams, and all kinds of odd noises there after dark. They say people have seen figures in the windows and on the grounds near sunset with black eyes and pale faces. They say you can see lights come on and off in the house after dark, and it's best avoided once the sun goes down. They say a lot of things, but as a writer of dark fiction, I don't put a lot of stock in local legends. I don't believe in Billy Bowlegs. I don't believe in Kissing Mary. And I don't believe in the hitchhikers they say you can pick up by the West Bay Bridge. The Martin House, however, is something I do believe in, because when I was young, I experienced it firsthand. It was 1993 or 94 when it happened, and I was about 7 or 8. My mother had worked at the same hospital for years, and that hospital had chosen to do their employee appreciation picnic on the grounds of the Martin House. I have to believe they were aware of the dark history of the place, but like I said, nothing ever happened during the day, so they weren't worried. The yard was huge, and the human resource department set up games and tents and all kinds of other things to entertain the kids while their parents socialized. I fell in with a couple of kids that I knew, and we played some games and explored the booths, but ultimately got a little bored with the scheduled events. These were kids that I didn't know well, but we all knew each other in that way that you know someone after spending years upon years going to these sorts of scheduled events with them. One of them was the son of my mom's friend. Another one was a kid I actually went to school with, but didn't really pal around with outside of things like this. Another one was just a kid who would wander up and fall back in with us when we all got together. There were about 7 of us that day, the rest of them just falling in with a group of kids to play games, and I can't remember who suggested that we play hide and seek. It was unanimously agreed upon, but after playing on the lawn for a few rounds, it became a little dull. When someone suggested that we could play in the house, that sounded like a much better idea. So we went inside, but quickly discovered the problem with playing indoors. The house was kind of a museum, and adults didn't really like it when kids were running around things that could be broken. We tried for a couple of rounds, but after being yelled at by a lady in a dress, we thought we might have to go back outside. That was when we saw the kid on the stairs. Like I said, none of us really knew each other, but none of us had ever seen this kid. He was youngish, probably 5 or 6, and he didn't really say anything. He just sort of stared at us through the slats on the staircase, and I'll remember the way he looked at us for my entire life. He seemed both fascinated by our appearance and utterly terrified at our game. He looked at us the way I looked at the dog sometimes, when he was making noise while my dad was trying to nap. He looked like he thought we might wake up a parent that would be angry. Someone suggested that maybe we could go play upstairs, and we all thought that might be a good idea. The upstairs was usually blocked off, but If that kid was up there, then the door must be unlocked. None of us had ever gone upstairs. It was locked, like I said, but we found the door was open, so we all went up. The upstairs was about the same size as the downstairs, but we saw a ladder going up into the attic and thought that would make the best place for hide and seek. It would be dark up there, probably with stuff to hide behind, and it would be spooky. What we found was a pretty big attic with boxes and furniture covered in sheets. It was dusty and cobwebby and reminded me of the opening of one of my favorite shows, Are You Afraid of the Dark? We decided who was going to be it, then we all went to hide. It was dusty in the attic, and a few of us got found right away when we started sneezing. I expected that we might see the kid we had seen earlier, but there was never any sign of him. I didn't think much about it. Kids rarely question things that don't come from adults. And as we played, the volume of our game became louder and louder. We began to scream with joy every time someone was found, and some of them had taken to scaring each other instead of just playing hide and seek. I'm sure that some of the people from downstairs could hear us, but given that we were 2 floors up, we might have been mistaken for just regular noise. I was hiding behind a vanity near the back of the attic, peeking out from around the edge of the sheet, when I heard a little voice in my ear that scared the crap out of me. It scared me because up until then, I'd been the only person hiding behind the vanity. You guys shouldn't be here. You're gonna wake up Daddy, and he'll be mad." I turned around, and there he was. He was crouched down behind the vanity, looking at me with these big, sad, scared eyes. And now that I was closer, I could see he was dressed in suspenders and a grubby-looking white shirt. His feet were bare, and his hair looked like someone had cut it with a bowl. I asked him who he was, but he shook his head and put a finger to his lips as he made a shushing sound. "Shh. You're gonna wake up Daddy, and he's gonna be mad." I started to ask him who he was talking about, when all of a sudden, we heard loud footsteps coming up the stairs. Someone was yelling, but it wasn't regular yelling. Usually when my dad yelled, there were swear words in it or some kind of direction. This yelling was just babbling, like an angry beehive or a car when it needs an oil change. It was angry, and it was loud, but there really wasn't any substance to it. The game quieted down as we all became the hiders. We knew that we shouldn't be here. We all knew that if we were found, we'd be in trouble. So we all took to hiding as someone came very angrily up the ladder. I could see the others as they hunkered around the other covered piece of furniture and storage boxes. They all looked scared, but they also looked excited. This was a different level to the game, something a little scarier. We all knew that this was the real game, and we had to win, or we might never be allowed to come back again. Through the white, oiling up out of the square hole, came a large something. It was man-shaped, but maybe not a person. It had arms and legs. I could see a head, but the rest of it seemed to just be shadows. It was like someone standing in total darkness, and I think even then I suspected that this was no museum curator coming after noisy children. The hairs on the back of my neck began to stand up, and as the thing started looking for us, I turned and found the little boy was gone. The other kids seemed to have felt it too, and as the thing moved towards the left side of the attic, we all started shuffling to the right. It knocked over a box and kept yelling in that strange, barely coherent way. It didn't seem unfamiliar with the attic, and I wondered if it was up here looking for us, or if it was looking for the little boy who'd been a stranger to me. Either way, we made our way back to the ladder and started quietly going down onto the second floor. We were almost all down when the thing turned and looked at the 2 or 3 of us that were left. He didn't have eyes, at least none that I could see, but I felt very seen by it, and the last of us went down in a herky-jerky pile of bodies. We ran back to the staircase, and that's when someone else found us. We burst through the door that led out onto the stairwell, and almost knocked over a lady with a tour guide name badge. She blinked at us and did not seem at all happy to see 7 or 8 kids coming out of a restricted area. She asked what we thought we were doing in there, and we told her that we thought it was open. She said no, the door was always locked, and told us we better get out of there before we got in trouble. When she asked how many of us there were, that's when we seemed to disagree. Some of us said 7, but a few of us insisted that there were 8. No, there was only 7 of us. Remember, that's why we didn't play Capture the Flag. Yeah, but then the other kid joined us, so we had 8. What other kid? There was only ever 7 of us. The kid in the suspenders. He was playing in the attic with us. At that point, the lady was completely frazzled and collected up all of us and brought us downstairs to have a talk with our parents. In the meantime, she had a few of the other people search the 2nd floor and the attic for a missing kid. Most of our parents were not terribly pleased about being drug away from the festivities because their kids couldn't behave, and we got an earful as we stood in the foyer of the Martin house. Some of us, me included, were more worried about the missing kid than getting into trouble. I can't speak for everyone, but I'd seen how scared he was. I don't know who he was afraid of, but I was afraid that whatever that thing had been, it had got him. As my dad let me have it for acting out, my eyes started to wander. I was looking at the pictures on the wall, the ones showing the Martin house through the years, before they finally settled on a very familiar face. The kid looked less scared and more confused, but it was definitely him, standing on the front lawn with 2 other kids and his parents. The house behind him looked a little different, but it was definitely the one we were standing in right now. Hey, that's him, I said, interrupting my dad in the middle of his lecture. Who's him? My dad asked, not appreciating being interrupted. That's the kid, the one I saw in the attic. The lady who had found us looked at the picture before shaking her head and telling me not to tell lies. No, really, I assured her. That's him. He was hiding with us. He told me that we were going to wake his daddy up. He looked really scared. My parents didn't believe me, but I've seen that picture since, and I know now that that little boy is one of the Martin brood. He was one of the kids who allegedly hung from the tree in the front yard, and I would have bet you anything that was his spirit we saw. The big shadowy thing didn't look at all like Mr. Martin, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. The kid didn't have black eyes like all the other stories tell, but maybe that's something that comes a little later. I've encountered a lot of strange things in my life, but that was one of my earliest scrapes with the paranormal. As of writing this, the Martin house still sits in the same spot. They've completely closed off the inside these days, and after that year, the hospital started doing their employee appreciation somewhere else. I don't know if it was the house itself or because they got a better deal somewhere else, but I never went back to the Martin house again. When I was a kid, I lived in a haunted house. I know that sounds, and I don't want to sound pedantic, but I lived in an actual haunted house. It was never anything sinister throughout most of my childhood. You would see things out of the corner of your eye. You'd come downstairs and find things moved a little. My mom even had her hair pulled in the bathtub once, but it was an isolated incident that never happened again. Things moved downstairs, you'd hear weird noises, sometimes you'd hear voices, but it never went beyond that. It was annoying sometimes, but I never really felt threatened. It was just something that happened. Until my parents decided to sell the house. I was about 18 or 19 years old, and I'd just dropped out of college. Medical hadn't been for me, and I was just really burnt out and kind of lost. I had been writing since I was 8, but I hadn't discovered horror yet, and was still trying to hash out something in the fantasy trade. I had a job, and I had my parents' house to fall back on, at least until they informed me that they were moving 2 states away. They didn't have it all set up yet, but my parents were doing well enough that they could afford to go ahead and pick up another house to flip, while they were still trying to sell this one. They offered me a pretty sweet deal. Stay at the house and watch the dogs while they went and got the house ready to move. They'd be back in about 2 to 3 months after they had everything ready, and then they'd start moving everything up there officially. If they hadn't sold the house by then, I was more than welcome to stay and keep living in it for a while. This turned out to be moot since I didn't stay in the house longer than about a month. It started out with little things. Things were always going missing in the house. Car keys, coffee cups, and books, but now they were nowhere to be found. I lost my car keys 3 different times in that month, and each time I had to go to the dealership and get a new one made, to the tune of about $50. My school textbooks that I was getting ready to sell to a classmate also went missing, as did my Game Boy, and a bill that I'd been planning on paying to keep myself out of debt. That's just the stuff I can remember, but it was a constant struggle, waking up and wondering what was going to be missing. The dogs also got very nervous in the house. My parents kept border collies, 2 of them, and they'd always been welcome in the house, along with the other menagerie of animals that my mother kept. They'd never been uncomfortable coming in and out before, but now they seemed to want to live on the back porch rather than in the house. The Florida heat is no joke, and when a dog with long hair would rather sleep in the non-air-conditioned back porch than inside, you know something's going on. I just chalked it up to them missing my parents, but I had no idea that it was about to start rattling up. That was about the time I started noticing the shadows. I slept upstairs more than downstairs, feeling safer upstairs, in case someone decided to break into the house. We had neighbors who were less than reputable, and our house had been broken into while we were on vacation before. I figured that if someone broke in, being upstairs would give me more time to get my gun ready and call the police. But the real problem was already inside the house. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night, awoken by a sound or by a feeling, and see something moving in the room. Not really moving, I guess. I'd see the shadows on the wall as they walked behind me or around the bed. I'd turn my head to confront them, but there would never be anybody there. The room was always empty, and a search of the house would prove that no one was in there. What's more, even though they were on the back porch, I knew the dogs would pitch a fit if they smelled someone in the house. They might not have liked being in there, but they didn't like anybody being in there unless they knew them. I tried sleeping on the couch, but it was the same problem. I'd hear whispery voices, see big long shadows up the wall, and when I turned over to confront them, they'd be gone. Sometimes I'd hear things moving if I slept downstairs, so I always made a habit of sleeping upstairs. Most nights I tried to have friends over, people to watch movies with, or people to keep me company while I was at home, but most every night I wound up staying there by myself. I'd stay at friends' houses sometimes, but never for very long. I had responsibilities at home, and none of their parents were ready for a long-term house guest. I should have left after the shower incident, but I managed to talk myself out of it. I really wanted to believe I had just scratched myself on something. No one wants to believe their childhood house is actually haunted by hateful spirits. I was in the shower about 3 weeks after they left. I was getting ready for work, soap in my hair, soap in my eyes, when suddenly something scratched my shoulder. I opened my eyes and immediately regretted it, but I started looking around to see if one of the cats had scratched me, or if I had run up on a hook or something. Mom had little hooks on the wall for loofahs and things, but they had already been taken down. I didn't see any cats or anything in the bathroom, and I went back to cleaning the soap off myself before inspecting the scratch. It was from my shoulder blade to my mid-back, and it looked like 3 long scratches that looked a little infected. I put ointment on them and put a big Band-Aid over them. Mom was a nurse, and she had a lot of stuff like that in the craft room, and tried to ignore it. It was just an accident after all. These things happened. So I fed the dogs and went to work as I always had. When I got home that night, that's when the weirdness really hit a fever pitch. The second I came in the door, it was around midnight, I could swear I heard people upstairs. Sounded like 4 or 5 of them moving around on the second story. I grabbed my dad's gun that he kept by the TV stand and headed upstairs to have a look. I hadn't seen any signs of a break-in, no broken windows or open doors, and I wondered how they'd gotten in without being seen. My parents had a big house, but most of the easiest ways to get in were through the living room. Unless these guys broke into a back room, I didn't figure they could have gotten in without me noticing. I came up the stairs, Beryl leading the way, but as I swooped into the big front room where my parents slept, there was no one there. I searched the house, upstairs and downstairs, but I found nothing. It was as if I had imagined the whole thing. The dogs sleeping peacefully on the back porch led me to believe that I was getting jumpy, and as I got ready for bed, I couldn't help but listen out to make sure that it wasn't just my nerves. That was when something kicked the door in, and I jumped about a foot. I was washing my face in the sink, and I winced as the soap came into my eyes again. I came downstairs several at a time, the gun back out front to find the front door open, and no one there. I'd expected to hear footsteps as I came down the stairs, maybe even people running, but there was no one. It was an empty house with nothing in it. I made another pass at the house, but still found nothing. I was getting jumpy, really not liking what was going on here, and it was getting hard to get ready for bed. I brought the dogs back inside, little as they wanted to come in, and I tried to coax them upstairs so I could feel like I had a little company. I had known these dogs all their life. I helped my mom raise them from puppies, and it was the first time I had heard them growl at me as they stoically refused to go upstairs. They didn't snap, but I got the feeling that if I pressed the matter much, they might. I finally left them downstairs, deciding to close my bedroom door and get some rest. I put a chair under the front door as well. No sense waking up to it slamming open again if I could help it. I managed to get to sleep after some unsuccessful tossing, but when I did, it was short-lived. In my dreams, there were people standing around me, whispering. I didn't know who they were. They were people I'd never met, and when I rolled over to look at them, they had no faces. They were made of shadows, and I got the feeling they were talking about me. I can't explain why. There's no reason I have to feel that way. But suddenly, I knew that I was the subject of their conversation. I rolled over in my dream, not wanting to look at them, and that's when I saw the shadows riding up the wall. They danced and capered across the flat eggshell paint, and I realized I wasn't sleeping anymore. I could feel eyes on my back as I shivered under the covers, and the more awake I came, the more I realized I could still hear the whispered voices. These were the things that I'd been seeing when I tried to go to sleep every night, and as I came awake, I found that the shadows were still there. They were rising up the wall, 7 or 8 feet tall, and their legs stretched out behind them grotesquely. I don't know what they were saying, but I didn't like it. It was something like muttering, a constant flow of low talk, and when I turned to look at them, they didn't disappear this time. I couldn't see them, not really, no more than I believe they could see me, but I knew that they were looking at me. I was filled with the most profound terror I've ever experienced. I didn't know what to do. Did I stay? Did I go? This was my home. I had always felt welcome there, and this was the first time I had ever felt unease in the house. In the end, I chose not to confront them. I rolled out of bed as quick as I could and ran for the door. The dogs looked at me like I was crazy as I went downstairs, but I didn't really care. I was not staying in that house for another minute. I went to my car, opened the door, but remembered that I'd left my keys inside. I looked back at the house, but the thought of going back in there made my knees weak. There was no astral lights in the windows. There were no weird figures looking down at me, but suddenly looking at that dark house by night made me never want to go back in there again. I slept in my car till morning, and after the sun came up, I went to get my keys and a few things. I called a friend of mine and asked if I could spend the night at his place indefinitely, and after telling him what I had experienced, he agreed. I don't think he believed me, but I think he believed I'd seen something. His mom was the kind of person that believed in most anything, and when I told her, she insisted that I come stay. I stayed at his house until my parents sold the place, and then I went to live with my grandma until I got a place of my own. I thought I might be done with the weirdness in the house, but it had one last surprise for me. I went back a few weeks later to help them move some of their things onto the truck, and when we lifted the sectional, I found something I'd been looking for. Underneath the couch was everything I'd been missing, stacked in a neat pile and just waiting to be discovered. My dad laughed about it, saying I must be kind of scatterbrained, but I knew I'd checked under the couch many times. I helped them move their stuff on the truck, but insisted on being gone before dark. They thought I was being silly, but I never came back there again after dusk. When they sold the house a few months later, I got my stuff out and never came back. My mom got into ghost tours and things later in life and did some research on the place after I told her about my experience. She was almost giddy when she told me about the checkered past of the house we lived in. Several people had died in that house, and not all of them of natural causes. There were rumors that 2 brothers had had a duel in the backyard, and one of them was still buried on the property. A boy drowned in the pond that sits at the corner of our land. Several people died of natural causes in the house, and whether or not they're the ones who haunt the house, I don't know. I find sometimes in my life that strange things seem to follow me. They seek me out sometimes, and I think that might have been part of the reason I started writing horror. The closer I get to understanding it, the more I know I'll understand my reasons behind it. And that's not the only strange thing that's ever happened to me. Perhaps I'll tell you about a few others sometime, if you like. I was drinking with some friends a few nights ago, swapping stories from old times, when my old roommate reminded me of these guys I used to hang out with. Or, as he put it, that time you hung out with those crazy pagans out in the woods. The crazy pagans in question were a coven I crossed paths with while living in North Georgia. No one tells you when you move here that there are a lot of non-Christian communes in the North Georgia hills, and given my interests, I ran into a lot of them. I've met pagans, druids, Wiccans, and many other practitioners of strange and foreign beliefs. Most are just hobbyists, people with a passing interest who find the mystic section of Barnes & Noble and go a little nuts. However, some of these guys take this stuff very seriously, and sometimes they take it a little too far. This story is about one of those groups. I had taken a semester of religious studies, and it had led me down a rabbit hole that had led me to a general interest in occult and mysticism. This led to a lot of brooding in the back of my college library, reading over old books, and making notes on strange subjects and odd topics. I had taken an interest in runes, and that was how I met Patrick, or Wormwood as he was calling himself in those days. He was teaching me about runes in exchange for some notes I'd made on energy exchange. We became friends and started hanging out a bit at a coffee shop in Dahlonega that catered to our sort of crowd. That was how I met Amadeus. Now, as enamored as I was with the idea of mysticism, Amadeus was still a little weird. I arrived to meet with Patrick one day to find a man in his mid-40s sitting next to him. His gray hair was braided down his back, his bald crown was oiled and gleaming, and he wore an honest-to-God traveling cloak, not one of those Hot Topic long coats that his crowd usually wore. His shirt was obscured with silver charms hung on long leather thongs about his neck, and he stared at me as he sat, fingers steepled across his eyes in a decidedly wizard fashion. He began following very probing questions at me before Patrick could make introductions. He wanted to know what I knew about everything from runes to tarot to demonology to herbcraft and everything in between. I was studied in quite a few subjects and was happy to flex my knowledge for him, so we spent about an hour talking shop. If I'd known what he wanted, I'd have left right then. He must have been impressed with what I had to say. "You seem pretty knowledgeable. It appears that Wormwood did not exaggerate your abilities. I'm looking for someone to come into the woods with us for a gathering. I need someone capable of setting up and maintaining a protective circle around our campsite, and to act as a guide while we await the spirits. I'm willing to pay if you're willing to come out for the weekend." We talked a little bit about what was expected, and we came to an arrangement. I would set up his protective circle, provide scholarly advice, and keep them from wandering off into the woods in the event that something took notice of our gathering. This would be a standard gathering for them, some 30-odd members of their coven coming together, and Amadeus was pretty clear that this was likely to get rowdy. He would give me $250 today, and another $250 at the end of the weekend. As a poor college student, it sounded pretty good to me. I had done similar things before, setting up circles and safeguarding people. Sounded like an easy $500 at the time. I took his money and set about getting a few things together for that weekend. I'd need a few things to pull this off, but honestly, I wasn't expecting much more than some drinking in the woods and a bit of babysitting. By Friday, I had assembled my components and made my way to the agreed-upon spot. They had decided not to use an established campground, but instead had decided to camp in a section of the wood they claimed to have heard about from someone in our circle. I arrived to find about 6 other vehicles down an access road, most of them old vans. Just as I was wandering off into the woods, however, one of the doors slid open and out popped a short blonde woman in a homemade dress. I say short, but she was probably about 5'2", with a long spill of silver blonde hair. She asked my name, and I told her, and she told me hers was Andromeda, but I could call her Angie. She was going to be my guide for the weekend. Amadeus said I should keep an eye out for you. I'm to assist you in anything you might need this weekend. That should have been a huge red flag, but I kind of shrugged it off at the time. Angie led the way, and we walked about a mile into the woods. She chattered all the way about how much she had been looking forward to this weekend. She said that Amadeus had been researching this area and thought that it was a good spot for communing with spirits. The area was reputed for sightings, and the coven was hopeful they could make contact with whatever lived in these woods. They kept saying coven, but as the campsite came into view, I was beginning to wonder if cult wasn't a better word. The clearing was a circle, 30 feet wide, with about 12 tents set up inside. The forest loomed around the campsite, and the old forest seemed to resent having a section of itself gouged out so people could camp. At the center of the tents was a fire pit, a big one, with a lot of styrofoam coolers sitting around it. I could see people bustling about the campsite, making adjustments to tents and setting up sleeping bags. Angie led me to the fire pit where Amadeus was reading a book and smoking what smelled like a joint. He looked at my duffel bag and asked if I'd brought enough supplies to put a circle around the whole campsite. I told him I had, but I was already doing the math and realizing the sage I had brought would go quickly. He nodded and told me there were supplies in his tent if I needed them. He told me also that Angie was going to work with me this weekend. "Use her in any capacity you see fit," he said, and a lecherous grin spread across his face that was hard to miss. That was red flag number 2. Seeing as most of his coven members were women, I was beginning to get a pretty good idea about what sort of setup I had stumbled across. I felt a little squeamy about it, but if they were comfortable with it, then who was I to judge? I had already decided what capacity I would use Angie in this weekend, and whatever ideas Amadeus had didn't figure into them. I wasn't opposed to sleeping with women I'd just met, but the idea of sleeping with someone who might not be 100% on board with it was a non-starter for me. I told him I needed to set up my tent, but it was quickly whisked away by a pair of women in homespun dresses, who started setting it up near Amadeus's large, ornate tent. So instead, Angie and I set about setting up the protective circle. I won't bore you with the details. My process probably wouldn't work for you anyway. We set about digging a small trench around the campsite and filled it with items I would use to seal the circle. If this sounds dumb to you, it sounds pretty dumb to me too. When I look back on it through the lens of time, I realize I was no less deluded than the rest of them. But that kind of code of silence with these communities is pretty common. Even if you think someone is full of shit, you keep your mouth shut, because you don't want them to call you on your bullshit. If you're lucky, you grow out of it. If you're not, you become like Amadeus and his little harem. Hopefully not literally, though. By the time we finished, I was sweaty and ready to settle down for the night.
Angie had been a pretty big help, and as we talked, I learned that she'd been with the community for about 7 years. One of the women, whose hair was very similar to Angie's, kept bringing us water, and I started to suspect that she might be Angie's mom. We set up the ingredients, and as we finished, I instructed her to start lighting the sage bundles. I had placed them every few feet. Once they were smoking, I lit the sticks and leaves that I had put in there too, and hoped they would create a smoldering circle that would last until morning. When we stepped back inside, I spoke some pseudo-Latin, made some more vaguely mystic hand gestures, and declared the circle closed. That seemed to be enough for the coven, and they began to set up around the fire pit. The coolers, as it turned out, were full of beer. The women brought out a large pot full of soup makings and set it on a hanger over the fire. Amadeus brought out a trunk from his tent, and I saw him pass out baggies of what I assumed were drugs. Mushrooms seemed to be the drug of choice, but there were a lot of people lighting pipes, and more than one person I saw snorting something off the back of their hand. A group of young men were listening to Amadeus wax philosophical, and he leaned over to let me know that my secondary duties for the evening were about to begin. I sighed. I guess I was on guide duty then. I'd played the guide before at gatherings like this, and it was rarely fun once people started using drugs and getting drunk. I guess designated adult sounds less fun than guide, but that was essentially what I was there to do. My job was to make sure that no one wandered off into the woods, no one slept on their back and drowned in their own vomit, and no one tried to jump into the fire. Amadeus and his flock drank heavily and used heartily, but I was surprised at how tame the gathering was. Amadeus and about 5 or 6 young men were pretty much waited on hand and foot by the 24 women, and Angie seemed to think it was her job to do the same for me. I had soup when I wanted it, despite me telling her I could get it myself. She also intercepted anyone who tried to offer me a beer or a drug and kept a bottle of water close at my hand. She helped me with the 2 or 3 times I needed to help someone from tripping over the circle, and she was a delight to talk with. She was knowledgeable about a lot of the things that I was interested in, and I found myself having a good time, despite being an outsider and what was likely a cult gathering. I was just about to make a Kool-Aid joke when the soup pot was taken away, and 3 women carried out a heavy iron vessel that they hung in its place. It was ugly and ill-made, not the beautiful thing you usually think of for these sorts of things. It looked like a big teapot, so much as anything, and the women started shoving bundles of herbs into the top of it. I had no idea what kind of herbs they were, and when I asked, Amadeus, he just winked and tittered. I told him if they were planning to flood the campsite with smoke, I wouldn't be able to guide them if I was under the influence of whatever he was putting in that pot. He snorted, "These herbs are not for us. This is smoke to entice the spirits." He called everyone close and set them around the fire as the kettle began to heat up and the smoke started creeping out. "Good evening, my children. The meal has been eaten and the circle has been set by our most generous guide." What followed was a scattering of applause, and I nodded half-heartedly. "Now, for the reason we are all here. The smoke will attract the spirits that dwell in this forest, and we will be free to view them from a safe distance as they are unable to cross our barrier." The smoke had begun to increase a bit, and I could see it making its way up the spout and across the campsite. It smelled terrible, like burning syrup, but it didn't seem to be having much of an effect on anyone. Most of them were already tripping on mushrooms or any number of other things, and the smoke did little more than make them wrinkle their noses. As it began to bellow out, the herbs catching fire, Amadeus continued to talk about philosophy and magic and a good number of other things. His followers sat dutifully, hanging on his every word, and I tried to be polite as I checked my phone to see if I had any service. To no one's surprise, I had no bars, so I put it away and tried to act interested in Amadeus's impromptu TED Talk. As I listened, though, I started hearing noises in the woods. The smoke was pretty thick by then, Amadeus giving his dissertation in a fog bank, and I started hearing noises. I mentioned this to Amadeus, and he got pretty excited. He instructed his followers to start chanting. He took it up first, and they started copying him in a shaky, undulating tone. I got up and went to the edge of the circle, kind of figuring the smoke had upset some of the natural wildlife, and I wanted to see what we had attracted the attention of. It was midsummer, and the idea that we had pissed off a bear or a small group of coyotes or feral dogs was not outside the realm of possibility. I stood at the edge of the circle, not wanting to break it and mess up whatever protective magic I had going on, and I squinted out into the dark woods. Now, if you've never been camping out in the real woods, the first thing you come to realize is that it's really dark out there. I know that sounds obvious, but it's a different kind of dark than the normal city dark. The woods really only have to deal with the intrusion of the moon at night, and with the campfire starting to come down off its normal roar, it was pretty dark outside the circle I had made. I squinted and looked, but honestly, a bear could have swiped my face off before I saw him. I could hear something crunching around out there, something that sounded big. I returned to the fire, the flock still chanting and undulating, and I could hear the crunching noises coming from several points at once. "He has heard our call," Amadeus rejoiced. That was when the trees started shaking. Out in the woods, I could see the shadows of trees being shaken and pushed violently. Limbs were snapped all over the place, and as they shook, there was an underlying sound accompanying it. Something was scraping the tree bark, peeling it away angrily as whatever it was, whatever they were, kept battering the trees around the campsite. I say they because it wasn't just one tree that was shaking. It was 2, then 3, then 7, and before long, it seemed like the whole forest was trying to get up and leave. Above the sound of shaking trees and snapping limbs, I could hear animal sounds too. I could hear dogs and cats and birds, the grunt of deer, the growl of a bear, the snort of horses, and all of it around the campsite. I've been present for some weird stuff that makes me feel pretty secure in the belief that something was out there. But this was different. This was downright terrifying. The flock, however, was in ecstasy. This is apparently what they had wanted, what they had been waiting for, and they quickly moved to the edge of the circle so they could see what was out there. I, however, went back to my tent to get something out of my duffel bag. I was kind of done with this. The magic had gotten pretty real pretty quick, and I wanted to see what exactly was out there. I still figured our smoke had pissed off a herd of deer or maybe a wild dog pack, maybe even a bear, and I didn't want to suddenly become dinner for something big and angry. I had packed a deer spotting light that my dad had given me for Christmas, and I wanted to know right now what was out there making all that racket. When I came out with it, I lit up a big section of woods and started hunting. One of the boys that had been sitting with Amadeus slapped it out of my hand after about 20 seconds. But honestly, that was about 15 seconds longer than I needed. When the light fell on a deer, I almost breathed a sigh of relief. Well, not a deer. Not really. It had antlers, so I guessed it was actually a buck. The antlers, however, were long. The tines sort of wound together like vines. It was up on its hind legs, scraping its hooves against the tree in a way that I thought was kind of strange for a deer. I had heard of young bucks rubbing their antlers against the trees, mostly to get the velvet off or to scratch an itch, but I had never heard of them rubbing their hooves against the tree. When it turned its head to look at me, its eyes glowed like a dog's in a camera flash. When it turned its head, I could see that half of the velvety skin was torn, showing the muscles of its face and the bone beneath. I took all this in before the light was slapped out of my hand, and I backed away from the circle, suddenly wanting none of this. People were standing around the edges of the circle, and as I backed away, I saw someone step over the trench and walk into the woods. Others followed suit, stepping into the ditch and snuffing out the sage. This would create a hole in the circle. This would allow whatever that was to come into our campsite. In my mind, we were breached already, and this job had just become pretty dangerous. I am completely unashamed to say that I went to my tent, dug the padlock out, padlocked my tent from the inside, and stayed there until morning. As I pulled the sleeping bag up around me, I could hear people outside the tent. From the dancing fire pit, I could see the shadows of things in the campsite as well. Some of them were on 2 feet, but some of them were walking on 4 feet. Some of the people out there were laughing, others were crying, some were definitely screaming as they plunged into the dark woods. I shivered with fear till morning, and when the sun came up, I collected my things and got out. The campsite wasn't some sacrificial pit, though. I could see people lying around the campsite in various states of undress, and the area around the bonfire was trashed. Coolers were smashed, beer cans were stomped and torn, and vegetables and food packages were strewn everywhere. Of Amadeus, there was no sign. I never saw him again, and Patrick said no one had heard from him after that night. His coven dissipated after that, and I never heard from any of them ever again. I was never paid the other half of my fee, but I suppose that was fitting. I had failed to guide them, and the ritual had gone astray. All I know is I ran the mile back to my car and never looked back. I did a little research on my own when I got home. Turns out there have been a lot of weird happenings in those woods. People have reported seeing lights in the sky, hearing strange noises, hearing animals that aren't native to the region, and a feeling of overall dread felt by those who stay there overnight. People have gone missing in those woods too, and authorities have never found a trace of them. I'm not going to sit here and claim that I had some kind of paranormal experience out there. I'm not going to tell you that I saw a skinwalker or a wendigo or an alien or anything like that. I'm not going to tell you that I saw a ghost or a cryptid or any of that either. What likely happened was that Amadeus was burning some kind of psychotropic drugs in a kettle, and we all experienced some kind of group hallucination out there. These are the things that I saw, and these are the things that I told my friends as we sat drinking around our yearly bonfire that night. After I told them my story, more than a few of them moved inside. I guess maybe the dark outside the cabin was a little too dark for them now. So I got a weird message about 2 weeks ago. A message from Andromeda, aka Angie. Some of you may have read the story I posted not long ago about the time I went camping with a coven out in the woods. Some weird stuff happened, I got some pretty culty vibes, and they may have pissed off some spirits out in the woods. After locking myself in my tent for the night, I left the next day and never heard from them again. Until I got that message from Andromeda. I woke up from 6 hours of fitful sleep, so regular sleep cycle for me, to find a message in my Reddit inbox. It was as follows. Hey asshole, I read your little story. That's a real dick move trying to cash in on the suffering of my family. But hey, I'm glad you got some internet points from what was one of the worst days of my life. I can't believe I told you how I got my name. That was a story of significance, which I see wasn't important enough to add. I've never even told my husband that story, and you repaid me by abandoning my family to the spirits. I hope you're proud of yourself. I won't link the screen name because I don't want to dox the user, but I was ready to ignore it and move on at first glance. They read like a troll post, someone just trying to get a rise out of me. I tried to move on and started with my day, but my mind seemed to want to return to the message again and again. The more I read over it, the more one thing jumped out at me. The part about her telling me her name was unique, because she was right. I hadn't mentioned it in my story. She had told me how she came to be named Andromeda on that long ago night, and I thought it was interesting at the time. Interesting enough to remember, but apparently not interesting enough to put in the story. I suppose in a way, I had left it out because it was pretty personal. When she told me her name, when we first met, I had assumed it was a vaguely mystic-sounding name. After all, her mother had been named Cassio, and many of the other members had sported names like Beetlegeist or Orion or Ambrosia. I assumed that mystic names or spacey-sounding names had been selected to make them sound mysterious or wise. Andromeda, however, was different. Andromeda had had her name since birth. Mom named me after a princess in Greek mythology. She had hoped I would grow to be a strong leader with a name like that. I think my father approved as well. I haven't seen him since Mom left to be Amadeus' handmaiden. She and Dad's relationship had gotten rocky, and they split when I was 12. That was when we joined the coven. My dad died about a year ago. Cancer, they told me. I'd love to go visit his grave, though, make sure it's well maintained. I could hear her words echoing in my head, and it caused me to be transported through time for a moment. For a few seconds, I was sitting by the fire and listening to Angie talk about her family and the coven that she loved so much. After a few minutes of conversation, it became apparent that she really loved her newfound family. She had come to think of Amadeus as a second father, and remembering how he had insinuated that I might use Andromeda made me feel squirmy again, though she must not have noticed. We had spent a lot of time talking that night. I decided to press my luck and send her a message back. So if this is really Andromeda, you should know what constellation you were named after. It took a few hours, but she finally got back to me. Wow, did you really forget? I wasn't named after a constellation. I told you that. I was named after a Greek princess. After reading that, I was pretty sure we were on the same page. But I wanted to make sure. Have you visited your dad since we last spoke? You said you wanted to help him with some gardening. This one didn't take nearly as long, and 5 minutes later, she sent me another curt reply. My dad is dead, which I also told you. As for gardening, I don't know what you're talking about. I have been to his gravesite, and I help maintain it since I live so close now. That convinced me of who I was talking to. I apologized for the weird messages. I told her that sometimes people like to play games on the internet. I don't want to waste my time with someone only interested in LARPing through someone else's memories. I also told her that I was sorry about what had happened that night. I was young and dumb, and the situation had gotten out of hand pretty quickly. I regretted what must have happened to her in the chaos, and told her I was glad she had survived. That's how we began our correspondence. She was cold for the first few messages, answering in clipped little responses, but she began to warm up as we talked. She asked me about that night, asking why I had left and why I had abandoned my post. Again, I told her my only real defense was that I was a young, dumb kid who'd gotten in over his head. She wanted to argue this point with me, but ultimately she was forced to agree that the situation had gotten out of hand pretty quickly. I apologized again, telling her I had since gotten out of the guide game, and she seemed to soften a little. She still refused to talk about what had happened that night, at least at first. So we spent the next few weeks catching up on neutral topics. She was living in Arizona in her dad's old house. She was raising her son and had needed a change from the Georgia area. She had met her husband at a bookstore she worked at. They'd been married for about 5 years. She was mostly mad at me because the story had made her think about that night for the first time in 8 years. We talked a lot that week, skipping over problematic issues in favor of some neutral subjects. I was delighted she had reached out again. It answered a lot of questions I'd been thinking about since telling my story. Then, one afternoon, about a week ago, she sent me a new message. I think I'm ready to tell you the rest of the story. I'm sorry I was rude to you, though I still feel like I was justified to be. If you'd like to post it on Reddit, go ahead. Maybe people would like to hear the rest of the story. Do you want to hear it? I told her I would, and she told me what had happened the night I fled into my tent. On the night you ran, I was trying to quell the people who were heading for the woods. The noises were getting louder and closer, and I really wanted our circle to be maintained. I stopped a few of them at the circle's edge, turning them around, and then looked and saw you staring out into the woods. It was only for a second, but you had the weirdest look on your face. It was like you saw something that made your brain hurt, something you were incapable of understanding. I watched you, watching it, and I felt afraid of what exactly you could be seeing. What was it that Amadeus had actually summoned here? And could our circle really hold it back? Then someone slapped your light out of your hand, and you just walked away. I watched you go, completely shocked. You ran to your tent and just locked yourself in. What had you seen? What was it out in those woods that scared you so much? I didn't know, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I started to go after you to try to get you to come back, but that was when I saw my mom heading for the circle. I turned all my attention to her, trying vainly to make her go sit down. She was staring at something blankly as if something was calling to her. A lot of them had that look about them, but they must have been intoxicated, because they stayed down when I pushed them. Mom was different. She fought me, struggled against me, and when I tried to stop her. She finally had enough and shoved me aside. Then she stepped over the circle and headed out into the woods like a sleepwalker. I headed in after her, not thinking of anything but stopping her, but quickly regretted it as the darkness enveloped me. The woods were dark, the blackness hanging around me like a thick veil. It's just so dark out in those woods, though I guess I don't need to tell you that. It's a different kind of dark, though. A real dark. It's a sentient kind of dark, and the things that live out there know better than we do. One of those things found me while I was wandering around out there. Thankfully, I don't remember much about what happened that night. I only remember something found me in the woods, and it was so terrible that my mind blocked it out so thoroughly I can't even remember more than pieces of it now. All I know was when I woke up the following day, I was already sure I was pregnant. She stopped there for a time, clearly needing to collect her thoughts. I gave her time, not wanting to push too hard. She was telling me about what was likely the worst experience of her life, and I didn't want to be too insensitive. I did, however, ask a single impertinent question. A question I never got an answer to. The thing in the woods, was it a deer that stood on 2 legs? She said nothing for nearly 2 days. Then one morning, I woke up to a long message she had sent around 12 midnight the night before. So after I came out of the woods, I found the campsite in complete disarray. I had apparently been missing for a whole day, which explained why I was so hungry. Of the original 30 people, there were about 20 now. My mother was among the missing, as was Amadeus. A few more wandered back before Sunday, 2 of the women having that faraway look that I came out with. By the end of the weekend, we had 24 members of our 30-person coven. Our leader was gone, however, and that left us with a problem. Who would lead our group now? We piled into our vehicles and went back to the house, figuring we would decide on a new leader once we arrived. For a month, we just sort of rebuilt our coven. Amadeus had controlled all the bank accounts, all the financial records. We had to find some way to support ourselves. We had to figure out how we would pay our bills, how we would feed our members, how we would keep the large house and the land that he had rented for us. Since it was in his name, the landlord was under no obligation to renew our lease when it expired. These were things we contemplated, but others believed they had found the answer. Their answers doomed us in the end. She was silent again for a few days, apparently assembling her information. It took 2 more days for her to get everything together, and that gave me some time to think about what I had gotten myself mixed up in. I had stumbled into something, coven or cult, much bigger than even I had suspected. I felt even worse about abandoning them in the woods now, and I suspected that her story was only going to get worse as it stretched on. Then one morning, I found her next message. I don't know if you're aware, but Amadeus has 3 children. Capua is his oldest, and he holds a master's in religious study from Georgia Tech. Legua is his middle child, and she owns several businesses in the area worth quite a bit of money. I didn't know the older 2 very well, but I knew the youngest, Aberdeen. We had been friends when I first arrived, and he was only a few years older than me. Aberdeen was still with our coven. You met him, though you may not remember him. He was sitting around the fire with Amadeus and the other scholars the day you first arrived. Well, in the absence of the father, we had hoped that the son might serve. Aberdeen, or Abner as I always called him, was trying his best, but he was not his father. For one, Amadeus had trusted him with none of the accounts for the coven. For another, Abner was not well respected. He was not as ambitious as his siblings, and was not what you would call a strong leader. His father had often belittled him in front of the others, yelling at him for not being as successful as his siblings, and it had given him a complex that made him a bit of a people pleaser. He was the acting figurehead, but mostly it was the elders that ran the coven. At least, until Abner's siblings showed up one day. We had been on our own for about 6 months, and my pregnancy had become more than just an idea. I wasn't alone either. 2 of the other girls had come out of the woods pregnant, and one of them, Ambrosia, was having a hard time. Dr. Fussell had said all our babies were healthy, as far as he could tell, but that Ambrosia's baby was different. She seemed to be carrying it lower than expected, but he couldn't be sure without an ultrasound. It also seemed to be larger than either of the other babies, and she was having some mysterious bouts of pain and bleeding. Forstasia, the 3rd girl, was reporting some odd cramps, but was otherwise healthy. As for me, my pregnancy seemed to be proceeding normally, but since it was my first, I really had nothing to compare it with. I wasn't bleeding or having weird pains, and my baby was simply growing and moving as it seemed like it should. Abner had actually offered me a marriage proposal since we'd come back from the woods, and I was considering taking him up on it. He had no qualms about raising another man's child, and he admitted that he'd always been sweet on me. I had known that, of course, but I had never thought his father would approve of me. Amadeus liked me and all, but I had never considered I would be good enough for one of his sons. I agreed to Abner's proposal, and we were engaged. I was so happy. I would have a husband and a baby, and we could build a life together here. Then, one day, Capua pulled up in his big fancy Cadillac car. He came into the house, asking where his father was and why he hadn't heard from him in so long. Capua was often around, talking to his father and asking his advice on things. Capua was a minister, but it often felt like his plans were skirting cult territory. Truth be told, Amadeus had skirted into cult territory a time or 2, but he always maintained our strict coven status. Abner greeted his brother warmly, but Capua wasn't having any pleasantries. When he learned that his father was missing, you could see the gleam in his eye. He asked Abner if we needed money and asked how we were faring. Abner answered him honestly. Abner was leading us well, and we were making it. We weren't as comfortable as we had been, but we were making our own way. Abner told him about our engagement, and he congratulated us, though half-heartedly. He left, but he wasn't the last visitor we'd see that day. Legua came that afternoon in her Jeep. She had clearly spoken with her brother, because she asked right away about Amadeus. Unlike Capua, Legua did not often come to visit her father. She sometimes came to ask for money, and Amadeus often told her that he didn't have anything for her. For someone who had several successful businesses, she certainly had a problem hanging on to money. However, she acted as Amadeus's accountant and knew the kind of money we usually brought into her father's accounts. I talk about money, and that may seem strange. Our coven was self-sustaining. We grew crops on the land out behind our house. Amadeus had secured us nearly 5 acres, and we sold the extra produce at farmers markets and to local businesses looking for organically grown produce. 30 people don't eat as much as you might think, and there was always extra to sell. We also produced things like olive oil, cooked a certain amount of moonshine, and grew a little marijuana to help supplement our income. Legua always made sure our books were in apple pie order during tax season. We never quite achieved tax-exempt status like some covens, and this allowed her to know exactly how lucrative our coven was. When we told her that we didn't even have access to the accounts, she left in a hurry, clearly wanting to get a hold of them before her brother did. That was how the two of them came to be at odds over our small group. She took a break again, and I didn't hear from her for almost another 2 days. I took the opportunity to do a little research of my own, Googling the names she'd given me. Names like Capua and Legua, even Aberdeen, would stand out in a small town like Dahlonega. Without a last name, however, Aberdeen didn't bring up much. An advertisement for an Aberdeen Tools in Garland, an obituary for an Aberdeen Freeman, and a missing person case on an Aberdeen Forklay. Nothing too promising, but the last one made me curious. How many Aberdeens could there really be? The names Capua and Legua, however, brought more promising results. Capua brought only one person, Capua Forklay. His Facebook was inactive, but spoke about how he was the pastor of Fairweather Flock, and had several pictures of him giving sermons and holding services at his church. There was also a local piece about how he had been the head of a rising flock before he and his followers had disappeared suddenly and unexpectedly about 6 years ago. A different online piece was calling them some kind of religious cult that had suddenly and mysteriously disappeared, leaving some 70 people unaccounted for and his compound outside of Dahlonega empty. It seemed to be widely believed that Father Forklay had taken his flock to Mexico, where he had another compound from which he did missionary work. This had never been confirmed, however, and remained a piece of local gossip to this day. As for Legua, her name returned a LinkedIn page for a Legua Forklay, a Facebook profile that was also inactive, and several reviews for her business that pinned her in an unflattering light. From what I could gather, Legua Forklay had owned 2 restaurants, a trendy boutique, and a bar in Gainesville. I found an article linked to her name with a lot of speculation about shady business practices, and a comment left on her Facebook insinuating that she might have had a gambling problem. Another local piece questioned her involvement with organized crime, but that seemed a bit of a stretch in a place like Gainesville. As to what had happened to her, however, I could find nothing. A similar last name to the missing person case for Aberdeen led me to believe that this may have been the brood that Angie was talking about. When she came back, she apologized for the radio silence. I'll have to give you the abridged version of the rest of this. I'm on the move and my signal comes and goes. When I asked if she was heading back in this direction, she ignored the question and continued her story. For the next few weeks, things went along pretty smoothly. Abner proved to be a fairly capable leader, so long as the council was leading him. I was planning my wedding, honestly glad that Abner had suggested marriage the more I thought about it. My prospects were limited as a single mother with a baby on the way, and Abner's prospects were not so great either, since he was kind of inept with women. We never got very far in our plans, though. Abner came to me one morning and told me that his siblings wanted to meet. They knew he didn't have access to the accounts, and they wanted to help him. Legua knew that our finances were stable but not strong, and Capua knew that he could help us into a more stable position. Abner was honestly just happy to meet with them. He had never been well liked by his siblings, and he said it finally felt like they were treating him like an equal. I warned him against the meeting, fearing that something was up, but he insisted that his siblings wouldn't hurt him. They just want to talk about the direction of the coven, that's all. They're not going to hurt me. We're family. I kissed his cheek and told him to be careful, watching him climb into his old Ford and drive down the dirt road towards town. That was the last time anyone ever saw him. I was worried about him, but I didn't have long to focus on his plight. That same day Abner left, they found Forsacia dead in her bed. One of her friends had gone to check on her and discovered her lying dead amidst a wash of blood. Dr. Fussell inspected the body and said that something had ruptured her insides, causing her to bleed out. Her baby was also dead, though it no longer seemed she'd been carrying a baby. Dr. Fussell wouldn't let anyone see it, but some had claimed that it had horns as well as hooves. That had made me grip my own stomach, worrying about my child. Dr. Fussell made house calls, but he was little more than a backcountry doctor. He didn't even have an ultrasound machine, nothing modern to tell us how our babies were doing or forming. I had felt mine kick a bit, but it felt normal, as normal as it could feel, I guess. I started making funerary plans for Forsacia, and before I knew it, it was 2 days later and Abner still wasn't back. I woke up one morning to find his siblings arguing in the entryway of our home. They had drawn quite a crowd, and I waddled down the stairs to join them, hoping for any information on Abner. He had been gone for days, as I said, but I had been in no position to make any inquiries about him. I came downstairs hoping for answers, only to find a divided room. Capua saw me and immediately called me over to stand with Ambrosia. He wanted to bring the coven into his flock, and after hearing about the events in the woods, he told them that we two were carrying miracle children. Gifts from God, he kept saying, and his direction for our coven was starting to sound very culty. He wanted to move us to his compound so we could be taken care of and the flock could grow. Lagua, however, was hearing none of it. She called him a shyster and talked about how he wanted to ruin her father's legacy and use us as tools. She wanted to keep us here and working, and I came to understand that her desires were more of a financial means. She wanted to make money. She wanted the money we brought in, especially since her brother now had access to Amadeus's funds. Money he has stolen from this coven, she claimed, and she was hoping to use our efforts in the local market to help offset her own debt. Standing there, even as young as I was, I came to see that neither of them had our best interests in heart. In the end, Ambrosia and I went with Capua, as did most of the coven. Abner was gone, and I was in no condition to leave in my state of pregnancy. Capua wanted to make the two of us into some kind of figurehead for this new flock, and I figured it would be easier to leave after the baby was born than it would be to leave now and risk his life. Lagua had some 8 of us that stayed. The rest of us left. The next 3 months went by in a blur. We all moved to the large private compound that Capua owned, and he set us up with quarters, fresh clothes, and 3 meals a day. Ambrosia and I were put in private rooms. We were treated like royalty. We ate what we wanted, did what we wanted, and we were well taken care of. Capua got us a real doctor, and he had concerns about Ambrosia's baby. He was too big to deliver naturally, and he had deformities, he said. The doctor was unsure. Ultrasounds have come a long way since then, but he said the head and body were oddly shaped. He told me that my baby was healthy looking and was a boy. I decided to name him Michael, and we went along for the next few months. It all went pretty well till the night of the birth. That was when all hell broke loose. Michael came at 10:22 p.m., and he was as easy a birth as I could have asked for. He never cried, which worried the doctor, but he started eating right away when he put him in my arms. He looked up at me the whole time, and when he smiled around my nipple, I fell in love with him. He was a handsome little boy, handsome as anyone could have asked for, and he had crystal blue eyes and a head full of duck fuzz. From the next bed over, however, it appeared that Ambrosia was having a hard time. They had been forced to strap her to the bed. She kept saying that something sharp was poking her insides. She kept trying to hit herself. The OB wanted to take her to the hospital, but Capua said she would deliver at his compound. They tried to sedate her so they could begin the C-section, but the drugs never seemed to take. I tried not to watch, but when she screamed out suddenly and pitifully, I looked over to see something brown and glistening protruding from her abdomen. The doctors had taken a step back, not sure what to do, and Ambrosia just went right on screaming. She writhed as the antler tore through her flesh, and her screams became less and less shrill as the blood began to flow. It shook its head, worrying at her, and I saw something smooth and brown push its way out. It looked at me, and I thought I knew what you had seen in the woods that night. It ripped itself from its mother like a butterfly from a cocoon, and I heard them scream as it tore out of the room, hooves clattering on the floor. Capua arrived not long after, wanting a report and clearly not liking what he heard. He took people with him to hunt the creature, and before he left, he looked at Michael and smiled. "Thankfully, your baby is normal. We'll need to run some tests once things have calmed down a little. Can't have two of these monsters running about." Thankfully, even after the day I had had, I still managed some clarity. I grabbed what essentials I could lay hands on. Some clothes for me, some clothes for Michael, some medicine, some food, and we stole a car from the motor pool downstairs. Capua had maintained a motor pool on his compound, and with all the men out hunting for this thing, it was easy to just leave. We sold the car the next day and hopped a bus to my daddy's old house in Arizona. It had been left to me in his will, and after a quick stop by the lawyer's office and some paperwork being signed, Michael and I had a home. We lived there until we met Jonathan, and now we live there as a family. Well, we did at least. That was the last message I had from her for nearly a week. I kept trying to contact Angie. That last message had been very cryptic, but she wouldn't send me anything. I was afraid that maybe she had gone back to her old home, back to Capua's compound even, and I spent the next 6 days in a state of anxiety. Then, on the 7th day, she sent me her last message. "I gotta make this quick. It'll be dark soon. About a month ago, Michael started having nightmares. He dreamed about the forest, about a dark forest, in which a voice called to him. The voice told him things, secret things that he couldn't tell me, and it also told him to come home. 2 weeks ago, Jonathan caught him trying to sneak out. What a boy of 8 thought he was going to do on the road alone, I don't know, but when Jonathan tried to stop him, he killed him. I heard the ruckus coming from downstairs and went down to find my husband dead and my son pointing a knife at me. He said he was going, that he couldn't make the voices stop anymore, and he was going to the woods. He was going to see his father. After seeing what he'd done here, I knew he didn't have much of a choice. So, here we are. I lit my fire in the same fire pit we used the other times we came here. The two of us are just sitting here, watching the sunset, waiting for whatever intends to show up. At first, I blamed you for all this. I thought you might have forced this into reality, but now I see that it's just my past catching up with me. I've run for too long. It's time to face the music. I can hear something out there. It speaks in the voices of every animal. It moves the trees as it watches us. Michael says it's his father, and I'm afraid it is. Goodbye. I hope the story was worth it. That was the last I ever heard from her. I looked into it, and the police did find a car on that old access road I'd parked on so many years ago. I told my friend, a cop in the Gainesville area, about the messages, but he only shrugged. They didn't find anyone out there, and he says it's honestly not the first abandoned vehicle they've found on that old access road. These are old woods, you know. Sometimes people just disappear into them. Whatever Andromeda was looking for out there, I hope she found it. I hope whatever Michael's father is, he treats them well. That's why I'm posting this. I feel like she'd want her story told. Andromeda would want people to know about the strange, bizarre, wonderful life she lived. A life that I hope she continues to live, out there within the green.
My parents moved when I was a senior in high school. Not all at once, they moved in stages, and I was allowed to watch the house while they took their things a little at a time to their new house. This was great for me because I had a steady girlfriend and a group of friends who would regularly stay at the house with me. My parents had a huge house, and as long as I didn't wreck it, they didn't really care what I did. As long as I cut the grass and fed the dogs, they sent me money for groceries and let me carry on. It was a very interesting time in my life, and it lasted until I was nearly 20. By the time they were ready to move, my life had kind of fallen apart. My girlfriend had met someone at work, and I caught her cheating and told her that we were done. My friends either started college or started jobs and didn't really have time for hanging out at a friend's house who did nothing but watch his parents home. I saw less and less of them and had less and less company to speak of, so when my parents made me the offer to come with them, I did. There wasn't a lot for me to do in my old town, so I packed up and moved to this place. They had been slowly transitioning into for the last 2 years. The house was actually a lot nicer than the one that they had moved out of. The old house had been big, but it was old and in disrepair. The yard was also pretty large and required a lot of mowing, even in the winter months, given where we lived. The new house was just as big, but had a stone fireplace and hardwood floors and a much smaller yard than the old house. My brother, a few years younger than me, enjoyed the new school, and my parents had moved into new jobs in the community. They told me that it would be much easier for me to start college here, but until then, I could get a job in town to supplement my income. It all sounded fine to me, so I settled into one of the upstairs rooms, and that was where I saw the ghost. Ghost might be too grand a term. It wasn't some spectacular phantasm or some dripping corpse moaning up the halls. It looked like one of the cheap ghosts from a low-budget movie, but it was certainly enough to scare the bejesus out of me. The first couple of nights I spent in the house, I was too tired to do much besides moving my things and falling into bed. The third night, however, was a little different. I had spent the third day in town looking for work and had figured that I was going to have a harder time finding work here than my parents. Unless I wanted to work in retail or fast food, I was going to need to look somewhere else, but that was fine with me. I'd seen on the television that there were a couple of hospitals the next town over, and they were always looking for someone to work in IT or at the switchboard. So that night, I fell into bed, but woke up a little after midnight to a strange sound in my room. My room was huge. It was 12 by 15, with a bed and a desk and a closet, but there was only one window, and it was facing out on the front yard. That time of night, the moon was coming in to light the section of floor where I had laid a rug and a coat rack, and that was where I saw it. At first I thought it might be one of the coats I had hung on the rack, but when it turned, I knew it was something a little different. It looked like a girl, about 15 or 16, made out of TV static. She was looking around, calling for her mother, and hadn't seemed to have noticed me at all. I lay in bed, full of fear and wondering just what the hell was going on, when she suddenly looked at the door, and her sorrow turned into fear. She started to shake, backing away from something, and before she disappeared, she screamed and vanished in a puff of static. It was the strangest thing that I'd ever seen, and as I laid there in bed, I think I convinced myself that I had just imagined it, or it was a dream. I had never had any trouble believing in the paranormal before, but this felt different somehow. This felt like a video or a projection, and I wasn't sure I really believed in it as something other than that. It was just a dream, some trick of the light, nothing more, and I rolled over as I faced the wall and tried to get back to sleep. The next night, however, I woke up around the same time with a tickling feeling on the back of my neck. I was facing the wall that night, sleeping pretty soundly, when all of a sudden it was like insects crawling across my skin. I slapped at my neck, and when I did not get the crunch of an insect, I turned over to check behind me. There she was again, the girl that I had seen the night before. She was standing in roughly the same place and mouthing fearfully at something that I couldn't see. She did this for a minute before turning our way and disappearing again. 2 nights in a row made it a little harder to push away as a dream or my imagination. I took my blanket and went to one of the other bedrooms upstairs, and thankfully I wasn't bothered by ghosts in any of them. I thought about just moving my stuff into one of the other rooms. My parents had said that I could have the old bunk room, but they hadn't said that I had to stay there. Still, I was curious now. This is some kind of mystery, and I really wanted to know how it ended. So the next day, when my mom got up to start cooking breakfast, she found me in the kitchen with a cup of coffee. "Mom, are there any ghosts in this house?" Mom laughed, and that immediately put me at ease. "No, sweetie. The house was only built 20 years ago, and no one has died in it in those 2 decades. Unless you're seeing some kind of ghosts from the land, there certainly aren't any in the house." Some of you may be skeptical, but if my mom said that there's no ghosts in the house, then I believe her. Mom is one of those ghost hunter fanatics. She watches the shows, she goes on ghost tours, and she generally believes in most of the spooky stuff that you see on TV. It's not just that she believes in Bigfoot and aliens, and I'm pretty sure that Mulder is her spirit animal. So, for her to tell me so distinctly that there were no ghosts made me think that I must have been wrong. I must have had a bad dream, like I thought. I decided to go back to the bunk room. It had the best light during the day and the best access to air conditioning, and went about my day as usual. I stayed up a little bit late that night, playing games with some people online and generally goofing off. So when I felt that tickle on the back of my neck again, I looked and saw the ghost girl standing not too far behind me. I nearly fell out of my chair, and some of the language I used probably would have made my parents pretty unhappy. She was still standing there, cringing and talking, but saying nothing. Then, after about 10 to 15 minutes, she disappeared, and I was in an empty room again. When Mom came downstairs that morning and found me at the table again, she laughed loud enough to make my dad ask if she was okay. "What's wrong, kid? Ghosts keeping you up again?" "Kinda," I told her, and I told her what had happened. She listened. Like I said, Mom was really into all the ghost hunting stuff, but after I finished, all she could do was shrug. "I don't know what to tell you. The realtors have to disclose if anyone died in the house, at least for the last 10 years, and I asked. You know me, I've always wanted to live in my own little haunted house, and the lady assured me that no one had died in the home, so no ghosts, though it wasn't for a lack of trying." I thought about that for a moment. Well, what happened to the previous owners of the house? Mom turned her back on me so that she could stir grits and seemed to contemplate how much to tell me. "Well, from what the realtor told us, the family that lived here before us built the house and another house in the valley below it. The down below is technically ours. We just don't know what we're going to do with it yet. There used to be a house down there, but it burned down before the family that built the house moved out." "But what happened to the family?" "She didn't say," Mom said, "but she did tell us that no one had died in the house that anyone was aware of." I thought about it, but realized that she had omitted something. "What about the house that used to be in the down below?" Mom was quiet, and then I guess she decided to stop being so cagey. The family that lived there died in the fire, and the fire was set under some pretty mysterious circumstances. I don't really want to talk about this first thing in the morning. It's kind of a sad topic to start the day with. I decided to let it go for now, but I also thought it might be time to do some research. I had the day off, no applications to put in or financial aid to seek, so I went to the library and decided to see if I could find any information about my parents' new home. There was a little bit in the local paper. It talked about the house fire that had killed the Maynard family, Mr. and Mrs. Maynard, and their young daughter, but it didn't mention much else besides the fact that Mr. Maynard had a brother. The article didn't say too much about him, but I suppose that he could have been the one that built the house. There was nothing else in the paper about the incident or occurrences at my parents' house, so I decided it might be time to speak to the source. The small town my parents had moved to was little more than a 2-stoplight town, but they had a small paper that ran the local events and a small bit of local gossip. The town crier had an editor and 2 writers on staff, and when I asked who had done the story about the fire at the Maynard house, they directed me to a man with thick glasses and a tweed jacket. He looked more like an English professor than a column writer, and after shaking my hand and hearing what I was after, he looked like I had force-fed him a lemon. "Yes, the Maynard fire was a tragedy, to be sure. Happened almost 10 years ago, and it was one of the first stories I covered. Did you have some questions about it or something?" I told him my parents had bought the other house on the lot, and I was looking for information about the previous owners. He took his glasses off and wiped them, but it amounted to the same thing that my mother had told me. He was stalling, trying to figure out the best way to tell me something that he didn't want me to know, and trying to figure out how much of it to tell me so that I would go away. There was more than just a house fire here, and I was beginning to suspect that it was something the town didn't want to talk about. Let me give you a piece of advice. This is one sleeping dog you need to let lie. It happened a long time ago, and the people involved are just trying to get on with their lives. Leave it alone, for the good of those that are still alive. I thanked him for his time and his candor, but I think his warning just made me more interested. I decided to swing by the realty office to talk to the woman who had sold them the house, and they had a few more people than the paper. The realtor, Marjorie, was out, but I told them I'd wait, and after about 20 minutes, she came back and handed the receptionist some papers before the woman pointed me out. Marjorie smiled, but I got the feeling that she didn't really want to talk to me either. "You must be one of the new owners of the Maynard place. I hope everything is going well." I assured her that my parents were very happy with the house, but I was looking for a little more info on the place. I lied and told her that I'd found something written on the inside of a closet, and I was just curious about the previous owners. When she asked what I had found, I told her it was gibberish, and I was just wondering if someone was in the occult or something. No, not that I know of. The Maynards left about 6 months after the fire, but their daughter was normal enough from what I remember. So do they still live in town then? I'm sorry, that's not something I'm at liberty to talk about. Regardless, the Maynard family is fine, and I don't think you should bother them if that's what you intend to do. They have suffered a lot after the fire, and they'd rather be left in peace. She seemed to realize that she had said too much after she finished and excused herself, saying that she needed to get back to work. I left the realty company, feeling like I'd taken 1 step forward and 5 steps back. I had more questions than answers, but I was really wondering if I could get to the bottom of this. Ghost girls aside, this mystery had its hooks in me, and I felt like the town had a vested interest in keeping something a secret. I headed back to the library, trying to find the threads again, and that's when I remembered what the writer had said. He said the fire had happened about 10 years ago, and the realtor had said they moved out of the house less than a year later. If the Maynard kids had gone to school around here, maybe I could find something with those dates and years. It was vague, and it made me feel a little creepy, but it was all I had to run with. It took a while, and I think the librarian thought I was a weirdo, but I finally discovered something. A news article about a local fundraiser had made me feel cold as a picture of the students involved scuttled across. It was the 4-H Club's annual farm auction, something they did in the spring. Now, one of the smiling girls was hugging a lamb and looking into the camera with frozen joy. It was the same girl from my nightly haunting, and the name underneath gave me a name to go along with the face. Stacy Maynard, 15, poses with her prized winning lamb, Chumley. The realtor had let it slip that they lived in town, so a quick search of the yellow pages, and I discovered that she had been right. She was still in town, living in the Masterly Hedge apartments. And after Googling the address, I worried over the idea of talking to her. Everyone else in town had turned me down cold when I kept up my questions, so who knew what this woman would say when I asked her? I tapped my pen as I looked at the address, finally deciding to give it a shot. What did I have to lose, right? She was out on her porch when I pulled up, the little patio off the side of the apartment, holding quite a few plants. She was watering them, her blonde hair sticking out the back of her baseball cap, and she looked up as I approached. She looked a lot like the girl from my room, the way a mother might look like their child, and I think she saw something on my face as she asked if she could help me. She looked like the realtor and the writer, polite, but apprehensive. I was hoping to talk to you about something. It's gonna sound strange, but you've been haunting my house." She raised an eyebrow at me, laughing nervously. That's a new one, but it's still a pretty sloppy pickup line. "No, I'm sorry, I'm making a mess of this. Did you used to live at 563 Sorora Street?" That seemed to make her nervous. "Yeah? Why?" "My family lives there now. I stay in the upstairs room, the one with the window facing the front of the house, and every night there's a ghost girl that looks a lot like you. She stays for a few minutes, she never says anything, and then she disappears." The longer I went on, the less impressed the woman looked. "Uh-huh. Okay, well, I think it's time for you to go now. This is all very interesting, but I'm not really interested in whatever this is." She started to go back inside, and I tried my best to find something to prove I wasn't just being a creep. The girl looks like she's about 15, and she looks terrified. She keeps calling for her mother while she watches the door. She looks absolutely terrified. I just wanted to know why she was so scared." She had been halfway through the door, but she stopped, and she turned around to look at me. "How do you know that? No one would be able to know that. I was by myself that night, and..." But she shook her head, realizing what she had said. She stood there for a moment, contemplating what to do with this stranger that had wandered up all of a sudden, before finally deciding to invite me in. "Sit here on the porch," she said, as she headed inside. "I'm going to get tea. I feel like I need something stronger, and I'm out of everything but cooking sherry." I parked it on one of the plastic chairs that she had on the porch, and when she came back with a jug of tea and 2 glasses, I thanked her. "You aren't the first person to come to talk to me. What happened was a town secret, but there were definitely people who wanted the real story. I swore I'd never talk about it again, but it kind of feels like you're part of this, and that's not your fault. So I'm going to tell you what happened, and when I'm done, I don't want to talk about it again. Do you understand? After this, I don't want to talk about this ever again." I nodded, taking a sip of tea as she emptied her own glass and refilled it. "Okay, so my dad and my uncle got the land from my grandpa. They had shared it, and my uncle wanted to build his house in the valley, while Daddy wanted to put a house on the hill. They were co-owners in a moving company, and they were doing pretty well. They were close, thick as thieves, but they couldn't have been more different. My uncle was a loving man, affectionate and supportive, but Daddy was a monster. He made life hell for my sister and my mother, but especially for me. I was his oldest daughter, and I seemed to get the brunt of his anger. He beat us. He yelled at us. He did..." She closed her eyes and shook a little. "Other things to us, but we were all too scared to say anything to anyone. But that's not why you're here, though. But I guess it is, too. That moment you're talking about was one of the last times he hurt me. The time before someone did something about it." She looked at the tea glass, watching the ice cubes rattle around before continuing. "Daddy and my uncle were fighting a lot before he died. He found out that Daddy had been taking money from the business, and he wanted him to give it back. Daddy refused, but my uncle had threatened to turn him into the police or something. I heard only snippets of their fight, or fights, over the phone that I only got one part of. But one night, Daddy decided to do something about it. I remember waking up to see my uncle's house burning, but I think I knew he was already dead. Daddy had killed him, killed my aunt and my cousin too, and I think the town knew it too. They couldn't prove it. Daddy had covered his tracks, but they remembered when he was younger, and they knew he was a monster when he grew up to be a bigger monster. They had seen the bruises on my mother and on us, and they had seen the animals dumped in the gutter near his house sometimes, and they knew it couldn't go on much longer. Then one night, he gave them their reason. Mom was at work. I'd come home early from a 4-H event, and Daddy was waiting for me. He asked what I'd been doing, asked why I was out so late, and when I told him, he called me a liar and a lot of other things. He tried to put his hands on me, and I had a momentary lapse in sanity. Maybe not. Maybe I just had had enough of being beaten, but regardless, I pulled away and ran upstairs. I slammed the door, pushed the dresser in front of it, and just screamed for my mother. I was terrified of what I had done. I knew that when he got inside, he was going to really let me have it this time. He was going to beat me, and there was nothing I could do about it. I called out for my mom. I begged her to come home and save me, but when the door opened with a crash, I couldn't do anything but hunker against the wall and accept my punishment. It wasn't punishment, though. It was just violence. I think that was when I realized that he was never actually punishing me, never delivering anything for my own good, and I slipped into unconsciousness. That didn't stop him, though. I woke up in the hospital, my mom crying as she told me how sorry she was, promising that nothing like this would ever happen again. I found out later that she had come home to find me unconscious. My dad was downstairs watching TV like nothing had happened, while I lay in a puddle of blood and fought for my life. She called an ambulance, and the police had been called, and my daddy was arrested. They took him to jail, and he claimed that he had done nothing. They had no proof that he had beaten me, no more proof than they had that he had burned down my uncle's house and killed his family. But the people of the town were tired of suffering him. While I was in the hospital, a mob came to the house and took him away. I don't know what they did to him, and I don't want to know, but he never bothered us again. He'd killed his brother and gotten away with it, and he'd beaten his wife and children for years, and they had ignored it. But putting me in the hospital seemed to be their tipping point. So that's what happened. I don't know why you can see it, but that was the moment that caused it. We sat in silence for a moment, listening to the wind rustle through the leaves and the potted plants whisper. And when I thanked her for the tea, I took my leave. To this day, I don't know why the girl appears in the room every night, but knowing what brought it on, I also don't much care. I've been back to visit Miss Maynard a few times since, and we've become pretty good friends. I also moved my stuff into the room across the hall, and I'm happy to report that no phantoms take up residence in there, at least not that I've found. I don't know if the wood in the room is so porous that it soaks up memories, or if what happened that night was so terrible that it made an impression, but the girl, to my knowledge, still appears around midnight before disappearing. I've slept sounder since I moved across the hall, and I have no intention of moving back.